Hello and welcome to the Breaking Muscle podcast. I'm your host, Tom McCormick, and today I'm joined by Greg Nuckols. Greg is a record-holding powerlifter, fitness writer, podcaster, and all-round training nerd who aims to help lifters and coaches to train smarter. In this episode, we discuss the predictors of muscular potential, training guidelines for hypertrophy, the role of strength in hypertrophy, why he's not drinking the effective reps Kool-Aid, and a whole lot more. So, without further delay, it's on with the podcast.
All right then, guys. As I said in the introduction, I'm delighted to have Greg Nuckols on the show today. Greg, great to have you here. Thanks for taking the time to chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for working late to make this happen.
You've written for Breaking Muscle before, so I'm sure most of the listeners are aware of your stuff, obviously, on your own website as well. But just take a quick moment to let people know, if they don't already, a little bit about yourself, how you got into training yourself, and then also how you got into writing and becoming a fitness educator, essentially.
Sure. So I'm a powerlifter. Used to have some records back in the day, but then other people got stronger, but that's the way the world works. Also coach people, do some writing for my website, Stronger by Science. But yeah, what got me into kind of this whole world, I guess, is I played sports growing up. My main sport was basketball, and I hired a coach when I was 14, during and after my first year of high school. And so I'm like 5'9.5", 5'10", about 177, 178 centimeters. But when I was a young lad, I was quite good at jumping, and so I could dunk with one hand if I got the perfect alley-oop. But I have quite small hands, right. And so I got into lifting purely so I could throw down with authority with two hands. Just so I could dunk on fast breaks in games. That's the only thing that got me into lifting. Or training seriously. And then, so I was doing that was going well. And then I also played American football and wound up with some pretty nasty concussion issues, including one that was a very, very serious concussion. The type where the doctor said if I had another one like that, it could, leave me with permanent damage and possibly wind up in a vegetative state, which, I wasn't particularly stoked about. They said no sport with any contact element for a minimum of 6 months. Oh, wow. So that knocked me out of the upcoming football and basketball seasons. So my coach just so happened, he was coaching me to get my vertical up, but it was Travis Mash, who's more well-known now for weightlifting, but at the time was just 100% powerlifting, yes. One of the best equipped powerlifters in the world at the time. So he was like, you think this sucks now, but you're actually quite a bit better at lifting weights than you are at real sports. So there's this other sport called powerlifting. Why don't you give that a shot? And that worked out because if you wind up with head trauma when training for powerlifting, you did something very, very wrong. That's not something that should go down.
Yes.
So yeah, that's what got me into powerlifting, and I just fell in love from day one. Always kind of thought in the back of my mind that I might want to be a trainer or coach or something like that. My parents weren't thrilled with that idea, so I went to college as a history major. Decided when I was already in the senior capstone class that I didn't want any of the jobs I could get with a history degree. So I transferred to exercise science, started writing basically because my then girlfriend, now wife, was my training partner. And, she's into it too, but not as obsessed as I am. And so I would talk her ear off all the time. And she said, hey, why don't you start a blog to, try to find some people who are as obsessed about this stuff as you are, so you can, talk to them all the time about this stuff. That just ended up working out, just took off organically. Wasn't really planning on making a living doing it, but that's what happened. And so here I am.
Absolutely. Okay. So just a couple of things. You got a coach when you were 14. Was that coach Travis Mash, or was there another coach before Travis?
No, it was Travis.
And so obviously he's, as you say, one of the best equipped powerlifters in the world. Was this an in-person coaching relationship or online?
It was in person.
So he just happened to be based locally to you?
Correct.
Okay, and so it wasn't just purely by chance that you sought this guy out. It wasn't. You didn't happen just to stumble fortuitously into the hands of one of the best powerlifters in the world.
Oh no, it was completely fortuitously. So there were two. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere, and there were two gyms in town. There was the YMCA, and there was a gym which is now quite old but was new at the time called Gym 365. And my neighbor Levan was the manager at Gym 365. So he heard that I was looking for a coach. He said, hey, come on down to Gym 365. A guy just started coaching out of there. He's really good. I think he'll be able to help you out. And that turned out to be Travis.
Right. Okay. Wow. That's pretty lucky.
Yeah.
So it all turned out nice. Okay. Fantastic. Well, it's interesting to know your background. Also, the fact that you sort of coach age 14 is different. That seems quite driven early on to be seeking that advice. Whereas most 14-year-olds, I imagine, think they know exactly what they're going to do. They're just going to go and do some bench and some curls, and they'll look like Arnie next week.
I was obsessed with basketball. I would have done anything to get better.
Okay, fair enough. So today we're going to talk mostly about muscle growth, but various factors around that, some areas that you've written some detailed articles on as well. But first of all, want to look into the possibility of predicting one's potential for muscle growth. Obviously, you've responded well to strength training. Other people won't quite get that same response, and it's not necessarily just because they didn't happen to get coached by Travis from day one. So are there some things we can look at? People talk about predictive equations for muscular potential, these sort of things. And if there are, well, we know there are, how much store, if any, should we place in any of these?
I don't think you should think about it much, if any at all. So realistically, there are some things that seem to correlate with responsiveness to training to some degree or another. In terms of projecting long-term outcomes, just the general size of your frame seems to be somewhat predictive. So people with big wrists and big ankles tend to kind of, just big joints in general, but those are the two that are the easiest to measure, seem to kind of be able to, on average, build more muscle. But that's nowhere close to universally true. And then there are some other things that, at least in research looking at untrained people and kind of how much muscle they build in the first 3 or 4 months of training, there are some gene allele variants that are somewhat associated with training responsiveness. Something that seems to have an impact is capillary density. So people with greater capillary density can maybe, deliver oxygen, nutrients, amino acids to the muscles a little bit more effectively, seem to grow a little bit better. If you have a more robust ribosome biogenesis response early on in your training career, that seems to be somewhat predictive of hypertrophy. If you do a better job with satellite cell proliferation, activation, differentiation, that seems to be somewhat predictive of training responsiveness. But the thing is, all of the gene stuff, each one of those allele variants is associated with a very, very small percentage of variation in what sort of phenotype you're going to wind up with. So they're predictive on a population level, but very weakly predictive, very, very weakly predictive on an individual level. And then the stuff with capillary density or ribosomes or satellite cells, all of those things you would need biopsies for, and fucking nobody before they've ever stepped foot in the gym is well, I'm gonna go to a doctor or a lab somewhere and have someone take out a biopsy from my quad and then train for 3 months, have them take another biopsy and see what my capillary or ribosome response looks like. So if that's
14-year-old Greg, if he was obsessed with being Mr. Olympia, might at that point maybe he'd have sought out that kind of investigation.
No, probably not. I mean, I would want to get paid to get a biopsy. Yeah. They're pretty gnarly. That's not a small needle that's going in. Yeah, that's pretty there are some things we know that are associated with how well someone's going to respond to training, but that stuff is more useful on a population level, more so than being able to predict how well an individual is going to do. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, really, I think the best way to find out how well you're going to respond to training is just train for a decade and see where you wind up.
Yes, yeah, well, I would agree, and actually that brings up something that seems to me. So you mentioned size of frame, and I think, as you say, that's probably a pretty good indicator as a general guide. But there seems to be some people that you look at them and they're what you would assume is a hard gainer, but they have great trainability and they're real responders. But they just they have to be in the gym and actually start lifting to find that out. And they otherwise, using these equations, might have written themselves off prematurely. And as you say, you've got to get in, do the work, and see how you respond, and also for a good chunk of time, because another thing that some people seem to respond quite quickly, make relatively rapid gains, but then that tends to plateau, maybe whether that's down to poor training and nutrition choices, I'm not sure, but other people just seem to almost be a slow burner. They never gain at this outrageous rate, but it seems it goes on for a longer period of time, and they end up at roughly the same space 5 years down the road or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing I'd say is, like, so for anything where you're talking about projecting long term where someone's going to end up, the question I like to ask people is, if there was a good way to answer that question, what would you do with the answer? So if you found out that, hey, I'm going to respond to training, average or maybe slightly below average, what are you going to do? Like, if you find that out, are you going to stop lifting? I would argue that, like, you probably shouldn't, because there's benefits of lifting beyond just, squatting 600 pounds or getting huge and ripped. Like, there's a lot of reasons you should be doing it other than that. And virtually everyone responds to training positively in some way, shape, or form. So just because you're not going to get the results that someone else is, you're still going to wind up better than you were when you started. So, I mean, yeah, I could see it potentially being useful if someone, say has above average genetics, or like above average factors that would be associated with responsiveness to training, but not like truly elite. So with training, they kind of wind up, so let's say they get into powerlifting or bodybuilding or some sort of competitive barbell sport, and they kind of get to that top 50 range, where maybe they're within spitting distance of being competitive at the world-class level, and it's kind of a question of, am I going to sell out and just dedicate my life to trying to be on the top of that podium someday, or, can I just be happy with above-average progress and just kind of chill, I could see it maybe being useful for people like that, where they could, if they could know with certainty, like, hey, I've got more than most people, but I just don't have what it takes to be one of those guys. That could potentially save them some time and effort that they may look back on and potentially regret, because they're like, oh, wow, I sank a lot of time and a lot of my life into this that I really had no chance for anyways, that I maybe could have spent doing other things. So, like, I could see it potentially being worthwhile in that one fringe scenario. And there also seem to be not a ton, but like a non-negligible amount of people who really do just respond to training really, really poorly. And so, like, that's certainly a minority of people, and I feel like they wash out anyways. You don't see many people who've been in the gym for 5 years who've made no gains, like, they've accomplished something at some point. So folks like that, it could potentially save them a few months of sunk cost. And they could take up some other form of exercise that they might respond better to. But ultimately, like, I think it's an interesting kind of like intellectual and academic question of, can we predict how well people will respond to training? And I could see it being useful if, say there was like an American Ministry of Sport, the same way there used to be like the USSR Ministry of Sport. Yes. And you're trying to like recruit athletes at a young age to compete for the glory of Mother Russia, and you want to know how well they're going to do. I could see it being useful in a situation like that. But just for a day-to-day lifter or personal trainer, I just don't think virtually any answer to a question of where am I going to wind up 10 years from now is all that useful and informative.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I mean, in some respects, I think it's similar to a kid at school taking an IQ test or some kind of test. You'll get based on the results you get. Having a really high score might make some people lazy, and they assume their talent's going to get them there, and sadly, talent doesn't build any muscle or strength. If you're not in the gym, and likewise. Just because you potentially have a low response at that age doesn't mean that you should give up on learning and educating yourself. So, I suppose there's a lot of similarities in terms of, as you say, there's multiple benefits to training in the gym, not just getting huge and ripped. So they should
for sure
should be considered as well. So if we sort of now park that, we know there are some equations out there, but they're not that necessarily useful. If you want to geek out and whatever you find personal interest, maybe that's something you do, but don't place too much store in them. Then we're thinking, okay, so are there certain training variables that I know that I can put this into my program and I get X amount in return? So, for example, if I increase volume load by this much, that equates to this amount of gains. I've spoken to a few clients and they're kind of talking and asking questions as if there is a concrete answer or a black and white answer to those. Whether it be how much volume load or how many hard sets or any other way you're kind of tracking volume. What are your thoughts on that? Is there anything that we can glean from that kind of detail and training variable?
Yeah, I mean there's averages. So on average, increasing. So let's just go variable by variable. All else being equal, training a muscle or movement, say 2 or 3 times per week, seems to be better than a frequency of just once per week, with diminishing returns past that. It's not necessarily worse to train a muscle 4 or 5 times a week than 2 or 3, assuming volume is still something you can recover from. But really, most of the ROI seems to be from going from a once per week frequency to 2 to 3 times per week frequency. On the volume front, it seems like there's probably kind of like a per session volume threshold more so than like a weekly volume threshold. So depending on what study you look at and what exercises they do and what population they're looking at, etc., it seems like somewhere between maybe like 5 and 12 sets per muscle group per week. Or not per muscle group per session is kind of the number you should be shooting for. So probably closer to the lower end of that range for someone who's less well trained. And also if you're doing kind of more stressful and damaging exercises. So for example, if you're talking about training the hamstrings and theoretically, you're going to build a program that's all RDLs for hamstrings, or you're going to build a program that's all lying leg curls. You can probably be up closer to the 12 sets of lying leg curls, but you'd probably want to be closer to the 5 or 6 sets of RDLs. Yeah. Just because, dude, you do RDLs, you do them hard, you get a deep stretch at the bottom of every rep, you're going to be fucked up the next day to a degree that you just simply can't do with leg curls. And it's probably also going to depend on frequency somewhat. So, if you're training a muscle once or twice per week, maybe 8 to 12 sets per session would be like a decent number to aim for. If you're training a muscle group 3, 4, 5 times per week, 5, 6, 7 sets, probably a decent range to aim for. But yeah, so if you're doing fewer sets than that per session, per muscle group, or per exercise, you'll probably still make progress. It's not that you can certainly go too low. So if you're super well trained and you're only doing 1 set per muscle group every time you train, that's probably not enough. But if you're below kind of that quote unquote optimal range, it's probably still fine. You'll probably still make progress just at a somewhat slower rate than you could. And if you're above that range, it kind of depends on the individual. So for most people, I'd kind of recommend not trying to push per session volumes too high. But there are certainly outliers who seem to just respond really, really well to super high volumes. And so you can't discount that. But, for the most part, kind of a moderate-ish volume per session seems to get the job done for most people. And then as far as intensity goes, if you're primarily interested in muscle growth, the world is your oyster. Anywhere between 30% of your max and like 85% of your max, as long as you're taking sets pretty close to failure, seem to produce similar muscle growth on a per set basis. That is true, but I also don't want people to think that kind of all intensity ranges are equally practical. So for example, if you were given a choice between two programs and you're told that both of these will result in similar quad growth, and one of them has you squatting 5 sets of 8 twice a week, and the other one has you squatting, and all of those sets of 8 are within 1 or 2 reps of failure. The other program has you doing 5 sets of 30 2 times a week, and all of those sets of 30 are within 1 or 2 reps of failure, and you're going to get similar results. You would be a madman if you go for the sets of 30. Because, even though those very well may be equally valid ways to produce similar muscle growth, the sets of 30 are just going to suck way more. And so, you very well may want to do that for, biceps or triceps. If you just, pumping out the reps, getting a sick burn. You probably don't want to do that for, squats, deadlifts, rows, most pressing exercises, even though high reps for pressing can be fun sometimes. But yeah, so, intensity doesn't seem to matter all that much theoretically for hypertrophy, but I think kind of the practical range is somewhere between 65 and 85% of your max, give or take. And then for strength, on average, higher tends to be better. But I would also say that for a lot of people, getting a really high proportion of your weekly training volume with really high intensity work, just my observation, tends to burn people out a little bit faster. Yeah. So, if you're going to do say 12 sets of squats per week, in the short term, you very well might make super, super awesome progress with all of those 12 sets being, 85, 90% of your max or above. But it's probably not super smart to train like that for years on end, or even months on end. So, if you're doing maybe 2 or 3 sets pretty heavy, and then the rest kind of in that 70 to 85-ish% range, that's probably a pretty good just average intensity range to set up a strength program. Mm-hmm. And again, that's not necessarily universally true for everyone. I've had clients who we do most of their training fairly light, and then 4-week peaking cycle with heavier weights, that's perfect for them. They really, really respond well to that. They make very consistent progress training kind of on average with lighter loads. And so we're not talking 30, 40%. We're talking, 60, 70% of your max, still somewhat heavy. And then, if they do train more frequently up around 75, 80%, they just don't seem to respond quite as well over time. So that can happen, but that's somewhat atypical. So yeah, that's kind of my answer to that question.
Okay, cool. So some good general guidelines for people there on frequency, volume, and intensity.
Another thing I'll say is so those general guidelines, somewhere a frequency of 2 or 3 times per week, somewhere between 5 and 12-ish sets per muscle group per session, and intensities, realistically somewhere between 60, 65% and about 85% for most of your training. If you just wrote a program with that kind of being the only things that go into it, it would probably be a fairly decent program, but the last thing that you need to account for is just how you personally respond to things. A great program on paper won't necessarily be a great program for you as an individual. So, let's say you go for a twice per week frequency with 8 sets per muscle group. You very well may find that you do that, you're never sore, you're always fresh, and you're not making any progress. Your performance in the gym isn't going up, your measurements aren't going up, and you feel fresh and good all the time. Well, that's probably an indication that even though that is a generally good and appropriate training prescription for most people, it's not quite enough for you. So you probably do need to increase your weekly volume, whether that's adding a 3rd session per week or increasing volume per session. Your personal data has come back, and you know that training volume isn't sufficient for you. On the flip side, someone else may do 8 sets per muscle group per session, twice per week. They're not making progress, but they feel achy and worn down all the time. They may need to decrease volume even further, or maybe try just a once per week frequency. That may be slightly less than would be optimal kind of as a population average, but that may be what's appropriate for you as an individual. So in general, if you're just an athlete and you're only worried about managing your own training, I think a decent place to start is just to look back and see kind of what programs have worked well for you in the past, what mix of training variables did they have, and use that as a starting point to start iterating and troubleshooting. I think if you're a trainer or a coach, a not bad way to go about it is use those kind of average training variables I gave, and use that as a starting point for most of your clients, and then troubleshoot from there and just see if people need more or less. But yeah, I mean, you should probably expect, I would say like 60-70% of people to get really, really good results with the mix of training variables that I provided. But some people are going to need more and sometimes quite a bit more. Some people are going to need less and sometimes quite a bit less.
Yes. Okay. So those, I mean, I think the key is those general guidelines, and with anything based on research, is to understand the value they have, but and place that in context. So they're almost like a compass, and then if you want to get down to the details of like a GPS telling you exactly what decisions you should make with your training, you kind of have to triangulate your position. So you take the scientific research, your training history, and maybe the knowledge of your coach and what they found to be effective, and use all of those and keep refining that, and then you'll be able to make more and more specific decisions and get, I suppose, more focused on exactly the details that are going to get you to your final destination. But first things first, start off with the general tried and trusted guidelines and work from there.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Also, you talked about individual differences. Someone's motivation to work hard, I think, is an underrated element, because, as you said, a perfect program on paper may have no result because they're just not driven and excited by it. Which is, I think, why sometimes the traditional bro split is very effective, because guys work their arse off following that approach, and then just to some extent working hard and working harder over time is one of the most important factors when it comes to building muscle and strength, for that matter. So I suppose that my thinking on that is we've also got to get whoever's doing the program to be excited and invested in that program.
Oh, for sure. So this is something that I like to bring up, that I think a lot of people who, I don't want to say focus too much on research, but focus a lot on research and don't have much practical experience, that they sometimes miss when they're reading studies. In the vast majority of research on trained subjects, so people with 2+ years of training experience, one of the things you see is that on average they don't tend to be all that big and strong. And another thing you tend to see is that the programs used in those studies are very straightforward, but will require a high intensity of effort. So if you're designing a program for a training study and you want to make sure that everyone is getting roughly the same stimulus, and not a bad way to go about that is just have people take every set to failure. That way that on every set they're getting quite a large stimulus from it. If you use percentages to prescribe load, which you used to see more often maybe like 10-15 years ago, a problem you can run into is if you say have people do 5 sets of 5 at 80% of their max, for a lot of people that's going to be a fairly challenging stimulus, but not super, super hard. For someone with just trash strength endurance, or who recovers quite slowly between sets, they very well might start missing reps on the 3rd, 4th set, and it wind up being like 2 sets of 5, a set of 4, set of 3, set of 2. And is way, way more challenging than it would be for someone who got all 5 sets of 5 with a couple reps left in the tank on the last set. And for someone else who has great strength endurance and recovers very fast between sets, 5 sets of 5 at 80% may be a trivially easy workout. What you've seen researchers do more recently is just have people push every set to failure, and really not do all that much volume typically. What you tend to see is that those folks who theoretically have 2 or 3 years of training experience in 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, build a very considerable amount of muscle and get considerably stronger. And these are with cookie cutter programs that probably don't have quite as much volume as they should because they don't want to overtrain and injure their participants, and certainly wouldn't be what someone might consider like a premium program. But the people still tend to make awesome gains because, like, in all likelihood, up to the point that they signed up for the study, they just simply hadn't been training very hard, which is why they're fairly small and fairly weak to begin with. And then when they're put on a program that's not great but is hard, like, if nothing else, it requires a lot of effort every set. They make great progress in a pretty short period of time because it actually forces them to start training hard. And so I think that should kind of be your starting point. You don't want to make training hard for hard's sake and, get into the mindset of, if I just wrecked someone during the workout, it was necessarily a good workout. But I think if there is a well-supported finding in the literature, it's that when you take people and force them to train considerably harder than they were before, assuming they weren't already like a quasi-masochistic volume maniac, they're probably going to make pretty good progress from it. And that on average, most people, when left to their own devices, probably don't put as much effort into their training as they should be.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a crucial point. And actually, it brings me to reps in reserve and the practicality of that for a lot of people, because in the in the lab and a study, you've got a couple of research assistants or whatever screaming at you to try and find another rep, and a true set to failure in those conditions is different to what I think people perceive to be failure in the gym when they're on their own and no one's watching. And actually, being able to use reps in reserve is quite a hard one for a lot of people, just because they're not actually aware of how hard going all the way to failure is. Especially if we're talking something in a high rep range. You mentioned 30 rep squats to failure earlier. I mean, I've never done that. 20 is the closest I've gone, and at about rep 12 I wanted to stop. So most people have probably never been anywhere near that, and the mind's probably giving up well before their muscles really are, and they're thinking they're working really, really hard, close to failure, and actually maybe they're robbing themselves of progress, because as we discussed earlier, you need to get relatively close to failure.
Yeah, I mean, so it's it's interesting because, like, so I'm 28, but I've been lifting for like 14, 15 years at this point. And back when I got into it, it was before like Shaco and then RTS style training and then like Eric Helms's research and whatnot, before any of that got really popular. And so, like, when I came up in lifting, I mean, most people said, like, hey, like, you got to push it to failure all the time, or a lot of the time. So, the like high intensity training was pretty big in the bodybuilding world, and on the powerlifting side of things, West Side was the biggest game in town. And so you have the max effort method, which is work up to a true max or sometimes like a max triple. You have the dynamic effort method, which is just speed work. That is quite submaximal. And then you have the is that the repetition method or the repetitive repetition method? Yeah, and so that's what Louis recommended for all assistance work, which is basically just shit ton of reps to failure. And so, like, that's how I came up in the sport. If you're working up to a heavy single, it's not a single at RPE 8. It's a max single, and you're going to go until you miss. And then for all assistance work, it was what Louis recommended for the repetition method of just do a bunch of reps and terminate sets at failure. Or at least that was like the interpretation that I and my training partners got from Louis' stuff. And so then, like, when RPE and like reps in reserve and all of that stuff kind of entered the collective consciousness, and I was like, I'll give this a shot. If you ask me, like, hey, how many reps did you have in reserve? I could pretty confidently say, like, I had 2 reps in reserve, or, I could have done 4 more. Because 80% of the sets I'd ever done, everything I'd ever done that wasn't dynamic effort, was to failure. Yeah. And so I knew what the fuck it felt like to be 2 reps from failure. And so I think that for a lot of people who came up training that way, or, came from a bodybuilding background where they were told to take everything to failure, I think when you learn about reps in reserve, it's quite intuitive. Maybe it's a hard sell to convince you that you don't have to train to failure, but if you decide to not train to failure, you can pretty accurately tell how close to failure you are. I don't want to say I fear, but at minimum, I wonder whether the efficacy of using reps in reserve to like assigned training variables is going to decrease over time, simply because there's a lot more people who are getting into the sport who didn't grow up with that sort of training background, who from day one have been told, like, hey, RPEs are good, RIRs are good. You don't want to push to failure every set. You want to leave 2 or 3 reps in reserve. I don't know that I would know what 2 reps in reserve felt like if I didn't have a big background of always training to failure. And from working with clients, one of the things I find is a lot of like the old heads I work with who, have been in the sport for 10, 15 years. If I tell them like, hey, go until you have 2 reps in reserve, and they send me a video, it looks to my eye like they generally have about 2 reps in reserve, or maybe 1 rep in reserve. Like sometimes they still want to push a little bit harder, but they seem to generally be good at it. With some of the younger and newer clients I've worked with, I have run into quite a few scenarios where they'll send me a video where they're supposed to have 2 or 3 reps in reserve, and to my eye, it looks like they have 5 or more. And then I'll assign them the same load the next week and say, take it all the way to failure. And they do like 7 more reps than they did prior. And I'm like, okay, you didn't have 2 reps in reserve. You had 5. I really do think a background of knowing what failure feels like helps reps in reserve based training to be more effective. I don't think you need to take every set to failure to optimize progress. Certainly not. But I do think that if you want to train submaximally and intentionally leave like 1 to 3 reps in the tank, I do think that spending some time consistently training to failure will help you make sure you're not lying to yourself with RIR numbers.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, anecdotally, a lot of the people I work with are relatively early in their lifting career, but they've followed some programs. Maybe they've trained with some buddies for a while or whatever. But taking them and just having them work up to a 6 rep max, then dropping the load off, and then hitting failure around about 12, picking away load we think they'd fail at about 12, and that's all they do for that exercise, has been really, really effective. There and then in delivering results, but then means that later down the line it sets them up, as you said, for using RIR. So I think that's a little bit of, from my experience, an example of just how that works and in a practical setting. So I think there's definitely a lot of value to getting used to knowing where your failure point is. And on different exercises that feels different as well. So just because you've always benched to failure doesn't mean you know what squatting to failure is. It feels like as well. Now,
no, I agree wholeheartedly. and just as like a general tip, what you just said, like that general training setup, I think is a fairly smart way to go about setting up a general strength program. So one of the things I do for a lot of the people I coach, if there's someone whose main goal is strength, but they also want to get bigger, want to either try to fill out their current weight class a little more or move up a weight class, or if they don't compete, if they mostly just want to get strong, but they also just want to get bigger and look better. One of the things I'll do is for their like main work, it'll be a little bit heavier, and I'll have them keep some reps in reserve. Or if they don't want to use RP or RIR, I'll just assign maybe like 80% for 6 triples or something like that, and then end it with a lighter set to failure that has them reaching failure at somewhere in like the 10 to 12 rep range. And that seems to work pretty well for a program that's focused on strength that will also get people quite a bit of growth, like adding that higher rep set to failure in at the end. And then conversely, if someone's main goal is strength, or if they're an off-season powerlifter and they want to take a little break from mostly heavier training for a while and want to fill out a little bit more, the inverse works pretty well also, where if you're having them do general hypertrophy training, just doing like a heavy single or double before they do their lighter, higher rep stuff tends to work pretty well for helping them maintain or increase strength as they're doing more like bodybuilder style training. I don't know how much this is a thing anymore, but I know that a few years ago, this was something that Charles Poliquin really helped popularize, and I know is quite influential for quite a while. The idea that you shouldn't mix intensity ranges within a workout. That if you're doing a strength workout, everything's 80% and above. You don't want to touch lighter weights at all, because in some way, shape, or form, that's going to mess up the training stimulus. If you're doing hypertrophy work, you don't want to touch heavy weights at all. It's just all kind of in that classical hypertrophy range. I don't know how many people still adhere to that, but I've personally found that that's just complete bullshit. If you want to just really idiot-proof a program so that you're going to make really, really solid muscle growth and strength gains at the same time, either just take a general strength program and add some lighter sets to failure, very close to failure at the end, so you still get like a really good hypertrophic stimulus, or take a good hypertrophy program and just add a set or two of heavier submaximal stuff before you do your lighter sets. Also tends to work really well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that's something I was aware of, and people talk about the signal to the body being clean or clear or whatever, for want of a better word. But the body is an incredible adaptive mechanism, so I don't think it gets confused by the fact that you did a set of 90% and then you've done some hypertrophy work. It doesn't probably just give up on adaptation at that point. So now we've talked about reps in reserve and like how close to failure you need to go, some different measures of volume in terms of volume load and hard sets and things like that, which leads me on to a topic I really want to get into with you, which is effective reps, because it seems to have really caught on as a method of measuring both volume and the effectiveness of your hypertrophy training. It's also something I know you've written a detailed article on, which is well worth a read for any listener who wants to explore this a little bit further. But your take on effective reps is it's not just purely in agreement with the effective rep crowd as such, but there's a bit of nuance to this. So I'd like to get some insight on that. So first of all, could you tell us what effective reps are, and then as designated by those that promote them, and then your thoughts on it.
For people listening to this, hopefully I'm not overstepping my bounds here, but I wrote quite a long article about this on Stronger by Science, if you just want to Google that. Or if you're someone who prefers consuming information in an audio format, I did a whole podcast on this on the JPS podcast, which you could check out. And so this is going to be a very short version of that, because I think that podcast was like 45 minutes long. And for a podcast covering multiple other topics, I don't really feel like giving the whole like 45 minute to an hour spiel on this. But yeah, so basically the concept of effective reps is that to promote muscle growth, basically reps need to be close enough to failure, because as you get closer to failure, due to the way motor unit recruitment works, you recruit more and more high threshold motor units, and the highest threshold motor units are the ones that are recruited last and are also the ones that are the most responsive to training. They have the most capacity for growth. And so you need to get close enough to failure to recruit those motor units and also to place enough tension on them to bring about a hypertrophic stimulus, and also some degree of fatigue for those motor units and their associated muscle fibers. That's not a bad idea. It makes intuitive sense, and at first I kind of just assumed that it was true, because it does seem to make pretty decent intuitive sense. And then when you actually look into the experimental research on it, it doesn't seem to have really all that much support. I don't have the article pulled up in front of me right now, but I went through all of the studies that one could use to argue for or against the effective reps concept, and I just wanted to see, what did they do in these studies? What did they find? What sort of populations were they working with? And essentially there are, I think, about 9 studies that one could use to inform themselves about the concept of effective reps, where basically you have one group training to failure or closer to failure, and you have another group training not to failure or further from failure than the other group. And you basically want to see, like, when you're training closer to failure, you're accruing more effective reps, more reps close to failure, and so that should promote, more muscle growth and better gains. I think I wrote about 7 studies in that article, and there have been 2 more relevant studies published since that article came out. But basically what you see is of the research that's out there, there's 2 studies, one by Godo and colleagues from like 2004, and one from Martorelli and colleagues from 2017, that are both on untrained lifters, and both seem to bolster the idea of effective reps. You have one group that is training further from failure. You have another group that's training, I think, to failure in both of those studies. And in both cases, the group training to failure made considerably better progress than the group training further from failure, like a twofold difference. The Goto study used knee extensions in untrained men, and the Martorelli study used, I believe, bicep curls in untrained women. In those two studies, you seem to find fairly strong support for the concept of effective reps. But then there was, God, I'm blanking on the lead author's name, but it was a study out of ETSU that was primarily using squats, looking at quad growth in trained lifters, that found the opposite. So more muscle growth in the group staying slightly further away from failure. And then there were, at the time I published the article, like 4 more studies where, one group would say train to failure and the other group would be like 2 or 3 reps shy of failure. And those 4 studies tended to find not much of a difference. And then, like I said, there are 2 more studies that have been published since then, and they also didn't really find any meaningful support for the idea of effective reps. It kind of depends how you slice and dice it, but I think the way that makes the most intuitive sense is just to look at the group of studies on trained lifters, so people who have at least a couple of years of training experience, and then the studies on untrained lifters. And so, like 2 of the 4 studies on untrained lifters do find some support for effective reps, and when you kind of meta-analyze the results of those 4 studies, which performing like a formal meta-analysis on 4 studies would be stupid, but you could do it, or you could just like take simple averages. But really, like, no matter how you look at it, kind of on average, there seems to be some support for the concept of effective reps with untrained lifters. But then in like the 4 or 5 studies on trained lifters, there's really no experimental support for it. And there's one study finding the opposite, that maybe staying slightly further from failure is possibly a little bit better. And so I think possibly, maybe there's at least something to kind of the mechanistic idea proposed by effective reps proponents, that you need to recruit those motor units, place enough tension on them, and fatigue them adequately. But maybe it's the case that with more trained lifters, you can use your muscles more effectively, basically, where you can get full recruitment or very close to full recruitment with maybe slightly lower loads, maybe a little bit further away from failure, and really at 2 reps shy of failure, say, you've really gotten about all of the beneficial stimulus from that set you're going to get, and maybe the last rep or 2, it's not going to hurt you, but it may not necessarily be necessary. Mm-hmm. And I also think it depends somewhat on the exercises that are being used in those studies, and like the degree to which the muscle is under tension the whole time. So, for example, the 2 studies that found the strongest support for effective reps, one of them used bicep curls, one of them used knee extensions. And the thing about both of those exercises is, for knee extensions, they're really only hard at the top of the rep. Well, mostly, and I'm pretty sure the machine they used in that study was one with like a pretty flat resistance curve. I know like some cam setups can make the rep similarly challenging through the whole rep, but that's not what you tend to see in research settings. So really, like, there's only one pretty challenging portion of the rep for knee extensions. Same thing for bicep curls. Like, it's easy to start a bicep curl through the mid-range of motion. It's a little challenging, and then like, I guess it's not locking out, but finishing a bicep curl is quite easy. So, it may be the case that in exercises where, you're only really, really stressing a reasonably small part of the range of motion, that maybe you need to go a little bit closer to failure to end up accumulating enough stress and enough fatigue on those high threshold fibers, because maybe they're not actually being fully recruited through most of the rep, and it's really just kind of that smaller range of motion. Whereas for all of the studies on trained lifters, they tend to use, they have tended to use more compound exercises that would place more stress on the muscles, not through necessarily the full range of motion, but through a slightly longer range of motion. So for example, if you look at, say, how the quads are stressed in a squat versus a knee extension, it's obviously the hardest at the very, very bottom of a squat, but until you break through the sticking point, you're stressing the quads pretty hard. And so you're through the sticking point when you're probably clear of like 90 degrees of knee flexion, give or take, and then a full squat, you're at maybe like 130 degrees of knee flexion or so. So like, that's a good solid 40 degrees knee range of motion where the quads are being stressed pretty hard, which is probably quite a bit longer than the range of motion through which the quads are being stressed, near maximally in a knee extension. Might depend on the population, might depend on the exercise you're talking about. I kind of think on average, stopping a rep or two from failure and going to failure cause pretty similar effects on a per set basis. But one thing I will say is that I think, looping back to something I said earlier, I think one of the reasons why the idea of effective reps caught on so well is a kernel takeaway you're going to get from that idea. And like the version that got the most popular is basically that the 5 reps prior to failure are your effective reps. So, if you're doing a set of 10 reps, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are your effective reps. And so, if you stop 2 reps shy of failure, you're only getting 3 effective reps per set. If you're doing a set all the way to failure, you're getting 5 effective reps per set. And so essentially you'd anticipate 3 sets to failure would be about as good as 5 sets 2 reps shy of failure. So on like a per set basis, going to failure is quite a bit more efficient. And so I think people hear about the effective reps concept and think like, maybe I should train to failure a lot. And then if they're kind of trash at using reps in reserve, maybe they were consistently training 5 or 6 reps shy of failure when they thought they were too shy, or now for the first time in their life, they're actually training hard, and now they're making great progress, and they're like, oh, this is fucking sweet. Whereas I don't think most people who were actually training, say, a rep or 2 shy of failure would have that experience on average. So yeah, that's kind of my whole take on it.
Okay, so 2 points that immediately spring to mind for me are, basically it seems to me that effective reps are a way of saying you need to train pretty close to failure, which isn't necessarily news for everyone. Well, probably isn't news for most people, but perhaps because of the coverage that volume's got as being the key driver of hypertrophy, some people were almost trying to volume their way to more muscle mass. So nothing was ever hard, but they were just accumulating sets. So perhaps for those people, it's useful information that there's a threshold they need to cross in terms of relative intensity. And the second one is that my understanding of the sort of origin of the term effective reps was from Berge, his myoreps protocol, which was essentially a time efficient way to provide a hypertrophy stimulus because it was a variation on rest pause. And in that context, it might be quite effective because you can get your stimulus in quite quickly if you're time pressured. But now it seems that people...
it goes back further than that.
Okay.
I know Fred Hatfield had a similar concept. So like time under tension was big back in his day, like in the 80s and early 90s. He was like, no, it's not time under tension. It's time under maximal tension, yes. Which he pretty much defined as when you're really straining, which, would be pretty close. It would be quite similar to the last few reps before failure. And I'm sure it goes back further than that as well. Like it's an old concept.
But yeah. So from that point, though, the myo reps, that sort of makes sense to me in terms of, okay, if you're short on time and you want to get an effective workout in as a hypertrophy stimulus, maybe a rest pause approach is effective, and it just so happens it's called effective reps. The way it's been spun since then seems a little different to that, and I'm not sure adds much other than you need to go quite close to failure. So would you be sort of in agreement with that? I can
I mean, so I think it kind of just depends like how anal people get about it. And the reason why I wrote that article or said anything about it in the first place is I did see people getting quite anal about it. And so I think so one of the things that irks me more than anything, and this is coming from someone who, like, my natural inclination is to quantify everything. Like that's just how I'm wired. So you mentioned, people just accumulating volume or volume load for its own sake. I think that is a prime example of people optimizing for a proxy rather than optimizing for results. And so, there's kind of like it's like a 2-step logic thing. So that volume tends to be associated with gains, and that, I can train in this particular fashion and rack up a ton of volume, therefore that's going to be good for gains. And suddenly you start writing programs just to try to maximize how much volume you can do and kind of lose sight of, well, is this actually maximizing my progress? And I saw people doing the same thing with the effective reps concept, where if someone just looked at it and they took away the kernel of, hey, I should probably be training quite hard, and not leaving 8 reps in the tank if I'm doing hypertrophy training. So I think it's almost like a response to people accumulating volume load for its own sake. Because, if you're leaving 6 reps left in the tank, you can be in the gym forever. Because, nothing's actually hard. You never accumulate any actual fatigue. And you can rack up, impressive volume load numbers, but have never challenged yourself and actually stimulated your muscles to any large degree in the entire session. And so I saw people clinging onto effective reps and doing the exact same thing with that, of how can I optimize a training program for effective reps versus just taking away the core idea of maybe I should actually be training hard. And so so you brought up myo reps. One of the things that I saw someone do and post about on Instagram and say I've hacked muscle growth. This is what the fuck you need to do. This is going to make you huge. They did a set to failure at, I believe, 60% of their max. And then they would rest 15 seconds and do a double, and then rest for 15 seconds and do a double. And just basically, take that out for 10 rest pause sets, and basically just, rest as long as they needed to hit a double and feel like they still had 2 or 3 reps left in the tank. Because if it's the 5 reps prior to failure, if you stop at 3 reps if you do 2 reps and those 2 reps leave you 3 in reserve, that's the 5th and the 4th rep before failure, which is the same as the rep before and the rep prior to that relative to failure. So, basically just keep doing doubles, still leaving 2 or 3 reps left in the tank, calling it rest pause, saying every one of these doubles I'm doing after 20, 30 seconds of rest, that's another 2 effective reps, suckers. I just got in 20 effective reps in 5 minutes, and you motherfuckers are taking, 7 sets to get that in, and that's taking you 30 minutes. You're so dumb. I'm going to get huge. And so I think that when you have any system based on quantifying some variable and then relating that variable to whatever training response you're interested in eliciting, there will be a tendency for people to focus on the proxy variable rather than the actual outcome they're interested in. And so that was my biggest issue with effective reps. I saw people focusing on that proxy variable more so than just the basic idea of, hey, you probably need to train hard.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Well, and I think it was valuable and vital for people to hear, because people do seem to just accept things and then miss the wood for the trees and pursue a specific protocol, which I think is, as you say, hacking muscle gain or whatever. And this is maybe an example of some people falling into that trap. The one thing I always wondered is why they ever do more than 5 reps per set. Why don't people just train at their 5 rep max permanently if then they've got 100% effective reps? But I'm sure there's some people have tried that. Greg, we're sort of up on time. I don't want to take too much more of your time, so I've got a quick fire a few questions for you, and then just give you a chance to let everyone know where we can find out a little bit more about you. So is either or questions quickly. So pizza or burger?
Burger.
Chocolate or peanut butter?
Can I say caramel?
You can.
Hang
on a minute, just so I know. Is that what I would call caramel?
I think so.
Okay, fine.
I generally enjoy both chocolate and peanut butter, but don't really love either one of them.
Okay. Well, I think that's odd. I'm slightly confused now. I've never had that response. Okay, a beach holiday or a city break?
Beach.
Steak rare or well done?
Depends on the cut.
You're almost as bad as Menno.
So come on. If it's a ribeye, rare all day. If you cook a ribeye well done, you need to be shipped off to the re-education camps.
But would you consider medium rare there, though, while we're getting into these things, or does it have to be rare?
Medium rare would be fine.
Okay, fine.
And especially if it's not a prime cut of beef, if it's a slightly lower grade cut, has a little bit more connective tissue to break down, medium rare might even be better than rare.
Yes.
But well done is an abomination. But then if you're doing a chuck steak and you cook it rare, you're never going to be able to chew through it. It's going to be completely inedible. And so you would need to take that to well done, braise that for 2 or 3 hours. So yeah, it just depends on the cut you're talking about.
All right. I'll let you get away with that one. In next one is, scrambled or poached?
Scrambled.
Okay. Those are those out of the way. So next question is, can you tell me something about you that we probably don't already know? This one always gets people thinking. You're not like a concert pianist in your spare time, or...
Let's see. There's really not that much interesting about me.
I didn't say it had to be something interesting. It just needs to be something we didn't know.
Let's see. I'm not like super good, but like a reasonably good Super Smash Brothers player.
Right. Okay. You're going to have to educate me now. So on this, what's a Super Smash Brothers?
It's a Nintendo like platform fighting game.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, like if I showed up at a tournament, like actually good players would wash me, but I can absolutely destroy all of my friends.
Okay, fair enough. Last question from me is, if I could get access to anyone in the world, who should I interview next?
Anyone in the world? Noam Chomsky.
High chance of success there then. So.
I mean, I think he's a brilliant mind, and he's like 94, doesn't have that much time left.
Obviously, we'll want to be on the show.
For someone who's like into fitness at all, have you guys had Mike Teixeira on?
No. Like, good shout.
Mike's the man. He's probably my favorite person to talk training with, because he's hyper analytical but doesn't read much research. Mm-hmm. And so like when we're coming to a discussion, I think like a lot of my opinions are formed based on like I would say a pretty healthy mix of research and training quite a few clients, and his is based almost exclusively on training but collecting prodigious amounts of data on a ton of clients. And so we come to a lot of similar conclusions, but get there in very, very different ways. And so I always really enjoy talking to him to kind of think through that thought process with him.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll add him to the list. Thank you very much, Greg. It's been a pleasure having you on. Please take a moment now to tell people where they can find out more about your work and your services.
My free articles are at strongerbyscience.com. If you want to check out the podcast, that is the Stronger by Science podcast. You can find it wherever fine podcasts are found, or at sbspod.com, or on the Stronger by Science YouTube channel. If you want to check out the research review I put out every month along with Eric Trexler, Eric Helms, and Mike Zordos, that's called MASS, or Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. You can find that at strongerbyscience.com/mass. And if you want to follow me on social media, I'm probably most active on Instagram these days, and I am just at Greg Nuckols. That's my personal account, so some fitness stuff, a lot of pictures of my dog, a lot of food content. For just purely fitness information, you can follow the Stronger by Science account at official Stronger by Science.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Actually, Greg, quick question. You mentioned the two Erics there. So you are in a unique position. Can you vouch that you have seen both of them in the same room and that they are indeed different people?
So that's a tough question to answer, because I've seen them both in the same room, but I can't preclude the possibility that it is just one person who moves back and forth very, very fast.
Okay.
To fool the eye.
Yeah, the mystery continues.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Greg. Thanks very much. Thank you very much for taking the time to chat. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me on.
That wraps up today's episode. Thank you so much for investing your time with us. We really appreciate it. If you enjoyed what you heard and took value from it, please do me a favour by heading to iTunes right now, subscribing to the show, and leaving a review. Positive reviews, like 5 stars, hint hint, really help the ranking of the show and will help us to spread the word and keep getting top class guests on. Make sure to follow Breaking Muscle on social media and me at Tom McCormick, that's TomMcCormick, MacCormick on Instagram. Bye for now, and I'm looking forward to catching you on the next episode of the Breaking Muscle podcast.